I start off sometime warming up, playing some old rendition of some sort of in-between of gospel and jazz, you know. When I was younger, I come from a movement called Sacred Steel. The older guys would say, "Hey Robert, you gotta learn how to play the old gospel hymns first." Where he leads me, I will follow. Start my day sometimes. So, you know, we got this pedal steel guitar, sort of, you know, the story of, I said the term Sacred Steel. It's my church organization is called the House of God Church. It originated all the way back in 1903, Black Pentecostal church. There was a lady, they'll probably kill me for boggling up this story, but Mother Tate, we call her in our church. She started the church in 1903, one of the very first early Pentecostal movements, actually the second one. They argue back and forth, we the first or the second, but anyway. Fast forward to like the 1920s, there was a guy named Willie Eason who came back from the war with a little lap steel, a little smaller version of this, in our church. And the church in those days couldn't afford organs, so the sound of the lap steel became our sound. So it's been 100 years. So that was all the sound, you know, whatever, you know, they had some pots and pans, or old beat up little drum set. Glory, glory, hallelujah, since my burden down. Glory, glory, hallelujah, since glory, glory. Hallelujah. And then once they got finished singing and clapping, you know, the steel had to sort of take over the melody. That's what it's like. It's still very much like that today. Very old school, old time church. So there was that guy, Willie Eason, who started that style. And over the years, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, we sort of had, you know, it's kind of strange how I grew up in, and, you know, if you fast forward all the way up until 1998, which was, we first had something called the Sacred Steel Convention, because our church music was, it was sort of undiscovered, right? So at this time, it'd been going on for pretty much, you know, 70, 80 years, and all of the inner cities from Miami, Florida, all the way up to Boston, Chicago, Detroit, all the way over to Compton, Oakland, and so forth, right? So the church became this organization, which was really like a Chitlin circuit kind of thing. And the older guys, from everybody from the 1930s all the way up into the 90s, they weren't allowed to leave the church and play, right? So they would sort of get yelled at, you know. They were called the Sinner Man, you know. So we had the first Sacred Steel Convention in 1998, which is where I got discovered by a guy named Jim Markle. He was from Florida. The Sacred Steel Convention was in Sanford, Florida. And I was talking to him, and he was like, "Oh man, I gotta send you some music because, you know, have you ever heard of the Allman Brothers?" I was like, "Who?" He was like, "Zeppelin?" I was like, "Who?" You know, the band? I was like, "Nah, man, you know, I'm from New Jersey, you know." And so that's all we did was we grew up in these inner cities, and we went to these states and played these sort of chitlin circuits. I mean, it was nonstop. So to us, they were gigs. We wasn't getting paid. If they did, it'd be like, they had your envelope with like, you know, $22 or something, you know. And so that was the story of me. So I get home, and literally a month later, I get a box. I'm living at home with my father in 1988, and I get a box like probably, you know, this big of CDs, and it had everything. I mean, you know, the band, Aerosmith, Led Zeppelin, the Allman Brothers. And it's funny because some of that stuff I'm still catching up on, you know, and The Who, and I don't know why I'm drawing a blank, but one of the bands, what's the band? Well, them too, Little Feat. Because it was kind of weird, because at that same time, right, I started playing shows in New York City in like 1999. We started playing club shows. I went to my first hippie show by a guy named John Medeski from Medeski, Martin Wood. And I remember because they were like, "Hey, we want to do a tribute to Sacred Steel music. This guy, John Medeski from Medeski, Martin Wood, is going to record this record with the North Mississippi All-Stars, and they potentially want to get you to be a part of it, but hey, why don't you come to a show and see Medeski, Martin Wood?" And I will never forget, you know, I get to the Beacon Theater in New York City, and it's Halloween, by the way, and I mean, it's 99, right? So it's the first time I've ever been in a theater, and it was like weed smoke everywhere, right? And they was getting down, it was Medeski, Martin Wood, and I get home, and my father's like, He comes out, storming out of the room with like a stick. He's like, "You've been smoking weed." I'm like, "Hey man, I swear I wasn't smoking, man. You know, I just came from this hippie show, man. You know." So he's like, "If that's what you're gonna be doing, you need to get out of my house." But anyway, so I recorded this record called "The Word" with Mississippi All-Stars and Medeski Martin Wood about a year later, and that became really like the first real recording that I ever did. And a little bit from that record that I did. Then I recorded another record called the Live at the Wetlands, which I wind up getting, that record wind up getting me in front of Warner Brothers Records at the time, and Eric Clapton had heard that record. And Warner Brothers had, we just had a booking agency, and the booking agent had us going to Japan, right? And so we get to Japan, this is probably like late 2002, and we're playing a club show, sold out club show, and right before the show, I get like, it's like, 10 security guards, and they're like, "Hey man, Eric Clapton is here to check you out." And I'm like, "What?" So, like, we were so nervous backstage, everybody got drunk, and like, we got wasted, We were so nervous, because it's like Eric Clapton's at the club show, in Tokyo, by the way, not here.
Yeah.
Right, all the way in Tokyo, Japan. So we played this show, we'll probably be wrecked, and so I thought we bombed. I was like, "Hey man," show's over. I was like, "Hey man, hey, whatever the Clapton, did he come back and say hi, or did he stay?" He's like, "Yeah, well, he left about halfway through the show. He had a great time," he said. I was like, "Oh, okay." So next thing you know, we get home about 2 weeks later. It's like, "Hey, you're gonna open this world tour with Eric Clapton?" I was like, "What?" So that was sort of my beginning. I mean, there was sort of all these other nuances of how we got discovered in the music and sort of got out. I mean, right along that time, I was also playing shows with Widespread Panic, String Cheese Incident, Dave Matthews Band, of course. And so all of that stuff was sort of happening, right? At the, meanwhile, I'm still kicked out of church and I'm not allowed to go back. I'm completely the devil, they said, So, but I'm having the time of my life, and I'm telling them, like, "Listen, man, I'm out here, I'm playing, and we're just having a good time in all these festivals. There's nothing but love, and there's millions of people all around the world, and we be having a great time." And it's funny because none of the bands, like, Clapton was very different from the Widespread Panic, which is very different from String Cheese, which is very different from the Allman Brothers, which is very different from the Dave Matthews Crowd, and so all of that was happening. So I just had musical ADD, So I'm like, "Hey, what do we play now? What kind of crowd is this?" So that was sort of the beginning stories. I mean, where I came from and how my influences. I'm still discovering all of those bands that's in my CD box. I don't know why I'm going blank, but I could take some questions. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody have any questions? And it's kind of funny, right? Because we have every year in Nashville, where our church is like, that's the headquarters of the House of God Church, where every year the whole community comes together, right? So it just so happened that the old lady who was running the church, who was very strict, like we all were the devils, like she died maybe like 5 years ago, right? So now there's all this overwhelming love from the church. But meanwhile, by the way, over those 20 years, I gave a lot of money to the church, right? I mean, I donated sound systems, remodels, just like, I mean, because it is what it is, right? You know, I still love them. Many of them are my family. So it's just so funny that they called me last week because the convention is next month, and they're like, hey, we finally want you to come play at the convention, you know. I'm like, man, I'm old now, man. So anyway, but yeah, to answer that question, so I'm like, we're all back, it's all fine now.
Here we got a question back here, hang on. Oh, same one, I'm sorry.
You take any influence from the country and western guys, you know, Buddy Emmons and Vance Terry and those guys, and Bob Wills, western swing stuff?
That's so funny you asked that question. Right around that time of 1999, there was a friend of mine. He was basically because it was kind of wild because being that our church is based in Nashville, right? Like we would kind of go to the steel guitar shops and like jam with like Lloyd Green and all these guys, right? So Lloyd Green, like he liked how I played, but all of the cowboys was like, you ain't really playing no steel guitar, you know? So all of that would happen. And then finally one day, ironically, I get in the mail a whole like UPS truckload of stuff. And Buddy Emmons had given me like all of these old guitars, his old hat, which is the reason why I started wearing derbies. It was the Buddy Emmons derby. For those of y'all who don't know who Buddy Emmons, he's basically the king of the steel guitar world, you know, the inventor of many things of how it sounds, played, tunings, chords, and all of that. So Buddy Emmons, you know, and he was like, hey, so he got my address, he sent me this stuff. Then I get on the phone with him, he's like, hey man, I just gotta tell you, like you're only like 21 years old and you're taking a steel guitar, you know, the places it's never been. I'm just rooting for you. You know, I'll probably be dead one day, you know. But I'm just excited to see you, right? So he had given me all these vintage guitars, which by the way, I was 21, right? And I didn't realize what all of these, it was, you know, like a frying pan, 1935, and a Rickenbacker and all these things. So here's another side note to that. I moved out from my father's house where all of that stuff came. We go on tour for probably like 2 years straight, nonstop. So I called my father and I was like, hey man, hey, I'm coming over to get all of those guitars and stuff I left there. You know, he's like, hey man, I sold that stuff, man. True story. True story. True story. He's freaking sold a 1935 frying pan, which is probably worth like $20,000. I didn't even ask him. I know my father, he probably sold for like $300, right? And including the Rickenbacker too. It was all Buddy Emmons, right? So it's like he was passing it down to me, and then like it's all gone. So,
yeah. Got a question right here.
Hello, being a Deadhead, I can ask if you had Jerry Garcia influence or listened to any of his pedal steel.
Yes, yes. The Deadheads always remind me of that, by the way. All through the years. Have you heard Garcia? But yes. Yes, I've listened to it. And by the way, I've gotten a chance to jam with Phil Ash and Bob Weir and play a lot of these songs, which is still the most complex music, you know. And I thought it was just me being hard because I'm kind of like, and then one day we were all in this rehearsal jamming with Phil and friends, and Carl Denson, right, who's a total jazz nut. Carl Denson turns around, he's like, man, whoever came up with these tunes is twisted, man. He's like, Phil, I don't know what the hell's wrong with y'all, man.
We got a question right here.
Yeah.
So given that the sacred steel kind of came from trying to substitute for an organ, I'm just wondering how that, you know, if that still influences how you play, you know, thinking about the music that may have come from another instrument.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, it did. Many times, I mean, a lot of these chords, the way, first of all, the way that I tune my guitar is kind of a combination of all of the pedal steels. So we would have our sacred steel tuning, and it's kind of, I guess it's just a testament to my wacky brain, but I came up with this. Right, and I'm still still kind of evolving. So you got these 12 strings. I started with 13, but it was kind of crazy. And you have, y'all don't know if y'all can see down here, but it's 7 floor pedals that I'm pushing. And also I have 5 knees things here that I'm, including an up one. So you got to be really on your ADD game to like, and you got to sing them, by the way, and play and do all of that, right? And so a combination of all of that kind of helps you get these chords, because in the church, you know, when a singer is singing, you kind of sometimes it gets, one thing gets too good, you don't want to stop, but you know.
We got questions.
Hey Robert, I wanted to ask you, how does your style of play compare to Roy Rogers' slide guitar?
You know, I don't know, man. I think we all, as slide players, it's kind of like we all get happy because when we see each other, because we're like kind of like these weird people that we're always trying to discover new sounds and new ways to wiggle. You know, I would say mine is really more because I started listening to great singers like Aretha Franklin, Frank Sinatra, Stevie Wonder, and trying to get all of these different vibratos and things like. So, I mean, it's kind of like one of those things.
We got a question back here.
Out of all of the places you've played and the people you've played with, what's been your favorite so far?
Oh, tough.
The Strawberry Fest. No. Man, that's. I get asked that question and it changes all the time because I forget. But to me, there's been like a bunch of sort of special moments. I'll say that one of the first times was playing with Eric Clapton on stage. At the first show was actually in Chicago, United Center, and it was the first time I ever met him. And like we opened the show, and then we're in between. Actually, no, I'm sorry. The first show was in Denmark, and we're in Denmark, and he walks. We finish the show, and he comes in. He's just like, "Wow, I've never heard anything like that before. I thought I heard everything there is to hear." And I was like, "Oh man, thank you, man." He's like, "Would you want to jam with me on stage?" And I was like, "Yeah." So that was the first time. And it's like, And he said, and actually his manager was like, man, that's the first time he ever did a 10-minute encore. We usually he's usually ready to run off stage. So, you know, that was a fun time. You know, the first time I ever played with Widespread Panic in Alabama, Oak Mountain. The first time I've ever seen the people do this panic dance. That was a fun time. The first actual Bonnaroo to me was the favorite though, which was, you were there? My man, the first one, right? You know, it was easily 100,000 people. So that was, to me, that's been the biggest crowd I've ever played in front of. Because, you know, they wasn't counting people back then. I mean, it was people about as far as you could remember. It was hardly no production. And we were all hanging out, me, Trey, I mean, Dave Matthews was there. I mean, everybody was there. So that to me is one of the more memorable ones. It also tells you how old I am, right?
Question in the back, of course. That's all right.
So for me, I feel like one of the most special things about your playing is the family aspect and how seeing the joy of your family all playing together. I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about just that experience and the songwriting maybe of playing with your family.
I'm glad you see joy. As they say, joy comes in the morning time. But yeah, you know, my family, you know, it's the one thing about having your family on the road and being in a band is we have uncles and aunts and grandmothers. So my grandmother's in charge of firing people. So yeah, she's in charge. Still to this day, she's 86. And she's like, get him out of here. You know, so that's kind of like my out. You know, like, hey, grandma said, you know, actually, she gonna call you, you know. So, but we have aunts and uncles and yeah. So the aunts even write songs, and the aunts will be like, you didn't record my song, I sent you. Yeah, it's like, it wasn't a good song, auntie. What do you want me to do? You still gonna make me some ziti next week when I get back home? So yeah, so we have a big musical family. Like, to be honest with you, like, so the Randolph family is literally 400 plus people, right? And between my grandmother, who had 14 siblings, and my grandmother alone, out of her 14 siblings, had 13 kids. So we're all like one big crazy family. Like, we have our own, literally, like every 3 years we do the actual everybody together Thanksgiving, and it's pretty much like a festival. And I just be quiet because everybody's a singer, everybody's a player, everybody's, you know, so it's fun though. We get on stage and the good thing about it is, like, when we fight, we got to make up because we're family, right? And it's not like anybody else. You still got to see them. So, and they're going to call you like, and your auntie calls you, why were you guys arguing?
And you don't remember.
And you don't remember?
That's right. Here's one.
Hey, Robert, I just wanted to say, man, first things first, it's an honor to be able to say I've shared a stage with you at this point. I just finished my set at 11.
Oh, man.
I gotta tell you a story. You are my initial, like, real deep dive introduction to gospel music. I grew up in a conservative household, but not, like, religious and not super, like, musically eclectic. And I remember I was eating cereal one morning, and my dad got the latest edition of Guitar Player magazine. I remember when you first hit the scene, I read that issue, and like your style of playing, like that was my lifeline to be able to experience your music. You know, it was like, oh hey, I want to listen to Robert Randolph. He's on the cover of Guitar Player magazine. So I learned your stuff, and one of your techniques or like things that really stood out to me was like your vocal, your like how emotive you are with your playing.
Yeah.
And I got to meet Darlene Love recently, and I asked her, you know, like if you had any advice to a starting musician. I'm a college professor now of music, and I just like if you had any nugget that I could distill and share with my students of either being more you know, emotive with your playing, expressing yourself more, like is there any like easily digestible little nugget I could share with my students?
Oh man. I would say to always be, have your mind open to get out of the box, because when you listen to music that's kind of outside whatever box, I mean, and we all kind of eventually start out in a box, right? Like if we're blues players, you kind of, because you're so into whoever you appreciate, you want to just study and kind of perfect all of those men or women, right? And when you think about like a famous Hendrix interview, even though we know Hendrix is the king of inventing rock and roll sounds and the king of rock and roll guitar, to him in his brain, he's just trying to play blues. It's just louder and more crazier and LSD and all that kind of stuff happening, you know. But he was really like, and I've spent a lot of time with Eddie Kramer, the famous producer of Hendrix and Zeppelin and all those guys, and he told me all of these stories about that. And I would say that's always been my thing. Like when I started out coming into church, when I started playing in church, I first started out wanting to be like my own Sacred Steel forefathers. And then one day at a church funeral of one of the people that passed in our church, one of my cousins gave me a CD of Stevie Ray Vaughan. And I was 18 years old at the time. And that completely changed everything I was doing. Because I was like driving in the hood and ghetto in New Jersey, and I'm blasting Stevie Ray Vaughan. I'm trying to pick up girls. I'm like, what is this? Put on some Biggie Smalls. I'm like, I'm playing Stevie Ray Vaughan. So, I mean, I listened to the Stevie Ray Vaughan Greatest Hits album probably every day for 5 years. Because I was trying to play all of those licks on this, which was very hard. And from there, I got into all the other stuff. Oh, I know the band that I was forgetting about. It was called Bad. That's who I'm forgetting about. And check this out. So the Bad Company CD was in that box, right? So literally, 2021, I'm driving, I'm in LA, I'm going to pick up something from a storage, and I have on XM radio, and I'm like, what is this band? Like, I never heard of this band before. So I just Shazam it, and it's playing, and I'm like, it's Bad Company. I'm like, oh, this is one of those CDs that was in the box. I'm like, I gotta start listening to this, you know? So I just started listening to Bad Company in 2021, see? You know?
You got there.
Yeah, I'm still learning.
Good. Hope we all are.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Take us out with something.
Take us out with
Robert Randolph.